Good afternoon. My name is Tom Beaker, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Nebraska History Museum the third Thursday of each month. A detailed schedule of this series, as well as information about society activities and programs, can be found at our website, www.nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would also like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support enables us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Our presenter today is Jim Potter, a longtime historian with the Nebraska State Historical Society and a good friend over the years. Jim did the basic research for the script of the Cowboy Exhibit that we see here in the building. And today he will be talking about Thomas B. Hord and his rise from an open range rancher to the largest livestock feeder in the country. Jim.
Thank you. As Tom said, I did work on the Cowboy Exhibit that you'll see here in the building for another few weeks. I also had been working on Thomas B. Hord for quite a long time, and while Hord really wasn't exactly a cowboy, he certainly had a lot to do with the open range cattle industry and the development of the Nebraska livestock industry. And so what I'm talking about today is kind of excerpted from what I plan to be an article that I'll be submitting to Nebraska History here pretty shortly, and hopefully if they like the fuller article, it'll appear in the magazine at some point as well. Thomas Benton Hord had reached a pinnacle of prominence by 1903 when a publication titled Nebraska Resources Illustrated proclaimed his cattle feeding establishment based in Central City, Merritt County, as the largest in the nation. The accompanying article outlined the immensity of the business carried on at this ranch. The conglomerate comprised 13 separate feed yards in the surrounding region, along with some 18,000 acres of cropland. The Hord enterprises annually finished an average of 10,000 cattle, 10,000 sheep, and 7,000 hogs, which consumed some 8,000 tons of hay and up to 1 million bushels of corn. Each feedlot encompassed from 10 to 15 acres and had its own windmill to water the livestock. The cattle were fed a specific ration, largely shelled corn, in an amount that, quote, they will eat up clean, leaving nothing to be used for the next meal that has been slobbered over and made unpalatable, end quote. Hogs were also fattened in the feedlots, mostly to follow the cattle and clean up the waste that the cattle had left behind. Each spring, the feedlots were plowed and planted to corn. Each separate feeding facility was connected to the main office in Central City by telephone, so Hord could keep in touch with his foreman. His key employees participated in a company profit-sharing plan in addition to receiving a salary. Purchase of grain used in the operation, only part of which was grown on Hord land, injected an average of $300,000 per year into the regional economy. In 1905, Hord reported shipping 1,000 carloads of cattle to market by rail, most of them going to Chicago. Now, this success had not always been Hord's lot. He was born in Marion County, Ohio, on June 15, 1850. He grew up on a farm and briefly attended Iron City Commercial College in Pittsburgh. On April 6, 1876, he married Sarah M. Hill, and Hord got his start in the Wyoming cattle business during the early 1880s with his older brother Amaziah and fellow Marion County, Ohio natives William E. and S.A. Guthrie. A partnership known as Guthrie, Hord and Company ranged cattle south of Douglas, Wyoming. Hord's journey from this early beginning in Wyoming to his being recognized as the Nebraska livestock industry's most successful entrepreneur at his death, December 24, 1910, was not always smooth. In 1908, he recalled that his success resulted from, quote, 25 years of fighting fire. The early 1880s were boom years for the open range cattle industry, an era characterized as the beef bonanza in the title of a popular 1881 book. The open range where the vast herds roamed was government land upon which no taxes were levied. The water and the grass were plentiful, and only crude structures of log or sod were needed for ranch headquarters. The profits to be made far exceeded the expense of buying the cattle and paying the minimum wages of the cowhands who minded them. Men such as Hord, along with financiers from the east and abroad, soon invested in Great Plains ranching. Over time, smaller ranches sold out to giant corporations such as the Ogallala Land and Cattle Company and the Bay State Livestock Company. Now, the Guthrie-Hord partnership was dissolved on January 1st, 1884, although Hord had already begun to assemble what would become the centerpiece of his endeavors in the range cattle industry, the 77 Ranch, located on a tributary of Lance Creek, northwest of modern-day Lusk, Wyoming. I'll try to point out, I didn't have a pointer, but here's Harrison, Nebraska in the Panhandle, here's Lusk, and the ranch was about 10 miles north of the modern-day hamlet of Manville. So just across the border into Wyoming from Nebraska, that's kind of where the Hord Empire began. In 1883, Hord bought the brand, the 77 brand, and a few deeded acres from D.B. Wyatt. Initially, most of the land where his cattle grazed was open range, but Hord continued to buy holdings previously patented by others. He could foresee that inevitably the unclaimed government land would be surveyed, settlers would press into cattle country, and free open range would be a thing of the past. While Hord was getting the 77 Ranch up and running, he and his brother also bought a large tract a few miles west of Cheyenne from the Union Pacific Railroad. This was called the Hereford Home Ranch, which advertised, as you can see, breeding of bulls for ranch use a specialty. Clearly, Hord had also realized that the future of cattle raising on the Great Plains depended on a better grade of beef than the wiry Texas Longhorns that had previously been dominant. The genesis of Hord's future Nebraska livestock feeding empire came in 1884, when some of the 77 ranch cattle were sent to Merritt County for fattening. Apparently, this development stemmed from Hord's previous affiliation with William E. Guthrie, who, with his brother and other partners, had recently purchased 40 acres near Clarks in Merritt County for a cattle feeding station. Merritt County's appeal as a livestock feeding locale was due both to its excellent Platte Valley farmland that produced abundant crops and to its transit by the Union Pacific Main Line, on which the finished cattle could readily be shipped to market. Through the mid-1880s, the idea of a beef bonanza on the western plains remained strong. On March 1st, 1886, investors headed by Wall Street importer Charles F. Smiley joined Hord, his brother Amaziah, and Thomas B. Adams of Cheyenne to incorporate the Lance Creek Cattle Company of Wyoming Territory with $1 million of capital stock and Smiley as the president. It is unclear how the connection between Smiley in New York and the Wyoming cattleman was forged, but undoubtedly Smiley was the link between the company and its eastern investors. To raise capital, the Lance Creek Cattle Company sold debenture bonds, which by July 1887 had netted $224,000. The company paid Hord $196,000 in cash and company securities for his interests in the 77 ranch lands and herd. Hord was appointed the company's vice president and general manager, and he spent some time at the ranch, as this picture shows, although this was probably taken somewhat later, and also was appointed the manager when the company decided to set up cattle feeding in Merritt County. At its inception, the Lance Creek Cattle Company planned to market most of its cattle directly from the Wyoming Range each fall, with a portion being sent for winter fattening at Nebraska feed yards. In 1887, the company began buying property at Central City, where it annually expected to fatten 1,500 to 2,000 head of cattle. In July of that year, Secretary Adams inventoried the company assets: 6,947 head of cattle, 134 head of horses and mules, Wyoming land, some of which the company actually owned, with fences and improvements, and 500 acres of land and improvements near Central City, much of it mortgaged. Adams valued the company assets at $209,000 and $209,281. That fall, the fall of 1887, Hord and his family took residence at Central City in a house built with company funds. This is it. A year later, the Lance Creek Cattle Company prospects got a boost when the Union Pacific Railroad built stockyards at Central City on land that the company provided. Now, throughout its history, the Lance Creek Cattle Company's main problem was that it began operations in a financial hole from which it was never able to climb. The company continually had to borrow money to operate, yet aside from eventually realizing modest profits from feeding cattle and hogs at Central City, it rarely earned enough to pay down the principal on its loans or the interest due its bondholders. Market prices for cattle remained low, and while the company began patenting additional Wyoming land it had previously used for free, the available range was becoming both overgrazed and scarce as more and more settlers moved in. Secretary Thomas Adams, who was also the secretary of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, summed up the situation in a letter to President Smiley on August 3, 1888. Quote, "The whole history of the cattle business for the last 2 years has been one long string of disappointments." End quote. One of those disappointments, more appropriately termed a disaster, had been the winter of 1886-87, which decimated the range cattle herds. Eventually, the Lance Creek Company determined that more than half of its herd had perished, but it took some comfort in that other cattlemen had fared even worse. In its 1886-87 financial report, the company wrote off $73,000 in losses and depreciation on the value of cattle and horses it had lost. At this time, the range cattle industry was also experiencing ruinously low market prices, and the formation of what was called the American Cattle Trust loomed up as a possible solution. The trust was going to be a giant corporation organized and controlled by the cattlemen themselves to counter the monopoly they saw embodied in the eastern meatpacking industry. It would be financed by absorbing the assets of its member companies, who would then become shareholders. The trust hoped to control the fate of every animal from the time it was a calf until it reached the consumer's grocery basket. The Lance Creek Cattle Company considered joining the trust, and on July 27, 1887, Secretary Adams sent a circular to the stock and bondholders asking them to surrender their company securities for that purpose. While President Smiley, Thomas Hord, and Adams thought entering the trust could help the company recover from its indebtedness, they never had the chance to find out. By April 1888, Adams was forced to report that the plan had been abandoned because the company had been unable to obtain the consent of a sufficiently large percentage of the owners of its securities. The American Cattle Trust never achieved its hoped-for monopoly and folded in 1890. The Lance Creek Company took several other steps to bolster its flagging business. In 1888, it formed a combination with the New Hampshire Cattle Company of Wyoming to share the labor and expense of managing the two companies' herds on the Wyoming range near Lusk by employing only one foreman with an ordinary force of men. When the final accounting was finished in December that year, Adams was very much gratified at the result of the year's experience as far as expenses were concerned. In 1889, the Lance Creek Company entered into a similar arrangement with the Converse Cattle Company, also of Wyoming, which it would continue for several years. Despite these momentary financial successes, the overall arc of the company's business continued downward. It was often difficult to borrow the money for each season's operations. Accordingly, in August 1889, President Smiley decided that the company should not feed livestock at its Central City yards during the coming fall and winter. It would be impossible to get more funds from the bondholders, quote, who are already our creditors and who are in a violent frame of mind and would not advance us a dollar for any purpose, end quote. Any attempt to borrow operating funds from Western banks would also be resisted by the bondholders. Moreover, said Smiley, quote, with the present beef market, I do not believe that it would be justifiable to feed anyway, end quote. Another problem plaguing the Lance Creek Company was that the corporate marriage of Eastern capitalists and Western cattlemen was not always harmonious. Smiley and the investors focused primarily on the company's profitability or lack thereof and tended to criticize Hord or Adams when the costs on the range or at the feeding station exceeded projections or when market variability reduced the expected income from the sale of livestock. For example, Smiley initially refused to sign the deed to the company land at Central City that Hord had agreed to give the Union Pacific to construct a sidetrack and loading pens until Adams and Hord explained how the arrangement would benefit the company. Adams, as the company financial officer, often found himself in the middle of disagreements between Hord and Smiley, noting in one letter, quote, I am disgusted at the way in which things are going at 6s and 7s in the management of our business, as no one seems to know exactly what he has authority and what he has not authority to do, end quote. At their December 1889 board meeting in New York City, the trustees of the Lance Creek Company centralized all financial transactions in Secretary Adams's hands in Cheyenne. All proceeds of livestock sales made from Central City were to be remitted to the Cheyenne office. Henceforth, Adams would also be responsible for the paperwork on all loans taken out by the company. Every proposed contract or agreement was to be submitted to Smiley in New York before it was finalized. Predictably, Hord, as general manager, was not happy. He promised to comply with the trustees' request, quote, although it will not be nearly as convenient, and it is simply taking the management out of my hands. But if that is the desire, I have nothing to say. We have always done the best we could, and worked with as little help as possible, and used all the economy it has been business to, but no one interested sees it, and of course it is not appreciated, end quote. Adams tried to smooth Hord's ruffled feathers by assuring him that the change was not meant to hamper his operations or signal that the board lacked confidence in him. Although the Lance Creek Company had continued to purchase land in Wyoming during this time, in 1889 it began to restructure its business, first by moving the range herd to Montana, now that the Wyoming ranges were becoming seriously overgrazed and crowded. Another motive that prompted the company to consider liquidating its Wyoming holdings was to avoid paying taxes. Open range, which could still be used for free, was available in Montana. These steps, along with the January 1st, 1890 suspension of interest payments to the bondholders, did little to solve the company's money problems. Some creditors apparently urged liquidation, but Adams cautioned, quote, "It would be simply recessious to attempt anything like liquidation now," end quote. Instead, the Board of Trustees voted unanimously in February 1891 to dispose of all the Wyoming properties and cease doing business there. The company would sell the ranch land it owned and focus on ranging cattle in Montana and feeding at Central City. As the manager, Hord was clearly aware of the company's financial problems, and as a cattleman himself, he had the insight to assess the range cattle industry's future. The days when investors could profit from simply grazing cattle on the public domain were drawing to a close. Future success would come from owning the land, stocking it with higher grade cattle, and controlling their movements with fences. Hord likely concluded that purchasing the Lance Creek Company's Wyoming lands, I guess it would be repurchasing in some sense, but purchasing the Wyoming lands offered a better prospect for a return on his investment than did the company's securities he and his family had held since 1886. Accordingly, Hord and his father-in-law, Robert Hill, surrendered some of their Lance Creek Cattle Company bonds and stock, having a book value of $26,000, to repurchase the 77 ranch properties now comprising some 2,400 deeded acres. After Hord repurchased the 77 ranch, he began to restock it with his own cattle and although he continued to spend most of his time at Central City in his role as vice president and general manager of the Lance Creek Cattle Company. By the end of 1891, the Lance Creek Company had completely ceased doing business in Wyoming. The new goal was to sell off the range herd as rapidly as possible and use the proceeds to buy feeders to put in the lots at Central City. Smiley predicted that within the next 18 months the company could pay all of its outstanding bills. Once that goal was realized, quote, "We shall turn our attention to paying back interest on our bonds, and I see no reason why within the next 2 or 3 years our company should not be in a perfectly sound and flourishing condition with its bonds at par," end quote. Unfortunately, Smiley's optimism would again prove unfounded. As the Lance Creek Cattle Company sought profitability in the early 1890s, Hord decided to see whether shipping cattle to England might pay. It was a complex operation involving rail shipment of the cattle to New York City or another port on the East Coast, followed by a 2-week ocean voyage to Liverpool. The steamships could carry from 450 to 650 head, along with 4 men to care for each 100 cattle and the fodder needed to feed them. The cost per head to ship a 1,400-pound steer from New York to Liverpool ranged from $10 to $15, plus insurance and sales commissions. Adding risk was that the overseas market could fluctuate wildly while the cattle were en route. Based on information Smiley received from a New York steamship broker, he figured the voyage would add over $25 to the price the company would need to receive per head compared with the price the animal would bring if marketed in Chicago. Although Smiley was skeptical about exporting cattle to England, he grudgingly left the decision up to Hord. Hord's brother Amaziah and his son Heber accompanied the first boatload in the spring of 1892. No records survive that indicate the exact price the cattle brought, but President Smiley's June 6 letter to Hord reveals the outcome. Quote, "I was very sorry to hear from your brother on his return to New York of the poor result of the sale of our beeves in Liverpool, but everything seems to be against us at the moment," end quote. The outcome of this particular shipment did not deter Hord, however. His son Heber recalled that 11 boatloads of cattle, some 8,000 head, evidently most of them Hord's private cattle rather than company cattle, were exported that year, presumably receiving higher prices than had this initial shipment. While the Central City feeding plant continued to be modestly profitable, the Lance Creek Cattle Company had not made much progress toward eliminating its debt and resuming interest payments to its bondholders. One bright spot was that the company had finally paid off the mortgages on its property in Central City by December 1892. By the next spring, Smiley predicted, quote, "We are going to be able to make a good big payment against our eastern indebtedness," end quote. Once again, his hopes were dashed with the onset of the financial panic of 1893. On May 18th, Smiley wrote Hord, quote, "We are having terrible times here now in the way of panics, etc., etc., and I see from the papers that your Western institutions are closing their doors right and left," end quote. He urged Hord to send him as much cash as could be spared from the company funds on deposit in Central City banks, quote, "especially as the bank that you used to employ once came to grief," end quote. Smiley could not resist reminding Hord, quote, "No one knows as much about the present finances of the country than we Wall Street men," end quote. In addition to the financial turmoil plaguing the country during the mid-1890s, drought added to the livestock industry's problems. Much of the Nebraska corn crop failed in 1894, and that summer's yield of hay in the Central Platte Valley was said to have been even less than the lowest estimates. A shortage of feed was probably why Hord fed no cattle at Central City during the winter of 1894-95. Another blow to the Lance Creek Company, to Hord himself, and to other stockmen. The local newspaper mentioned that the suspension of feeding at the Lance Creek Company yards depressed the value of property in Central City Township by more than 1/3. The drought did not ease in 1895 when the Central City paper reported that the Platte River had gone completely dry by fall. The hard times of the 1890s threatened not only the Lance Creek Cattle Company's prospects, but those of Hord and his family's personal enterprises. In early June 1893, Thomas B. and Amaziah sold their Hereford home ranch near Cheyenne to Chicago capitalist Lewis E. Engels, a total of 14,000 acres at a price of $140,000. Fortuitously, the sale was made before the worst effects of the financial panic might have made it impossible. As land prices fell during the 1890s depression, the Hords were able to add to their real estate holdings both at the Wyoming Ranch and also in Merritt County, probably with funds realized from the sale of the Cheyenne Ranch. Some of the lands were purchased by Robert Hill, Hord's father-in-law, indicating that he was still continuing to help his son-in-law ride out the economic downturn. Aside from his Lance Creek Cattle Company management role, Hord was also feeding some of his own cattle at the company feed yards in partnership with other cattlemen whom he had known since his early Wyoming days. Hord also invested in and was president of the Farmers State Bank of Central City until 1895. These activities indicated that he was diversifying his business interests with the help of friends and former associates as the fortunes of the Lance Creek Company continued to decline. The end for the Lance Creek Cattle Company finally came in February 1896, when the bonds issued at its inception in 1886 came due. In his report to the bondholders, President Smiley presented detailed financial statements showing that the deficiency between the company's net assets as compared to the $198,000 in unredeemed bonds had fallen from $95,000 on July 1st, 1891 to $37,900 on July 1st, 1895. He argued that if the bondholders would agree to a 10-year extension, the accrued interest on the bonds could be paid within a few years, and before another 10 years had elapsed, the company's property would show assets in excess of the bond issue. If the company were compelled to redeem the bonds now, he warned, quote, "it will necessitate the selling off of all of our assets at a time of extreme depression, and will stop the development of the paying branch of our business, the handling of young cattle, and result in a heavy loss to you." End quote. Notwithstanding Smiley's plea, some of the bondholders had had enough and sent in their bonds for redemption. Before they actually came due on February 29th, Hord and the other officers arranged to have a court appoint a receiver for the Lance Creek Cattle Company. Under receivership, the company's assets, then estimated at being worth less than 40 cents on the dollar, could be protected and distributed or sold for equal benefit to all the creditors. On December 19, 1897, President Smiley called a final stockholders meeting to wind up the company affairs. At the same time, Thomas Hord and his wife Sarah sold their Wyoming ranch near Lusk, the old 77 ranch, now some 3,100 acres and 1,000 head of steers, to another area cattleman for $16,000. It was likely the proceeds from this sale, along with Hord's own share of the remaining assets of the Lance Creek Company, and also assets he had accumulated independently or from his wife's family, that enabled him to acquire title to the company's Merritt County property for $1 and other valuable considerations in hand paid. Now no longer in the ranching business, Hord was now free to purchase livestock for feeding at Central City. Now he owned all the property there, wherever he could find them, and at the best prices he could arrange. From then on, his path to becoming the nation's largest livestock feeder was to be far smoother. In 1899, Hord began building a new residence in town and witnessed the marriage of his son Heber Hord, who had become increasingly involved in managing the family's growing empire. Also joining in the Hord enterprises were associates from the open range days, including Hord's former Wyoming ranch foreman Mike Chauncey, who managed the feeding operation at Clark's and later became a partner in several Hord companies. For the season of 1901-02, the earnings of the various Hord businesses totaled $193,900. Another one of his ranches, this one up by Neely. Mike Chauncey's story is interesting in its own right. When he died at Clark's in Merritt County on August 5th, 1954, he was said to have been the last surviving participant in Wyoming's notorious 1892 Johnson County Cattle War. Born in Canada, Chauncey grew up in Ohio, went to work for T.B. Hord, and followed him to Wyoming in the early 1880s. He was a foreman for Hord and other cattlemen, several of whom, but not Hord himself, played significant roles in the Johnson County War. This so-called war was an attempt by the big cattle barons in Wyoming to kill or drive out smaller ranchers and settlers on the grounds that they were nothing more than rustlers who threatened the large cattlemen's domination of the open range. In April 1892, the cattlemen, accompanied by, I think, about 25 hired guns from Texas and some of their own employees, such as Mike Chauncey, invaded Johnson County, killed two men, Nick Ray and Nate Champion, whom they had branded as rustlers, and then soon the cattlemen themselves were surrounded by these small ranchers and other settlers and had to be rescued by the U.S. Army. So the cattlemen were taken back to Cheyenne and held for trial, but all of them, including Mike Chauncey, were released when out of more than 1,000 people examined for the jury, you couldn't find 12 authentic jurymen, so they dismissed the case. Soon afterwards, old Mike returned to work for Hord at the 77 Ranch near Lusk. This was right after the Johnson County War and after all these guys had been released. In May of 1893, Mike had a shootout with Nate Champion's brother Dudley. Dudley was seeking revenge for the fact that the cattleman had killed his brother, and he came looking for Mike Chauncey. Well, in this episode, Chauncey actually killed Dudley Champion, and a coroner's jury ruled that Mike had acted in self-defense. Naturally, Hord and his other business associates were aware of this episode, and on June 7, 1893, the Lance Creek Cattle Company president Charles Smiley from New York wrote, quote, "I am glad to see that the coroner's jury acquitted him, and I hope he will not get in any further trouble, though I fear that those Johnson County men have spotted him, and I think if I were in his place, I should give northeastern Wyoming a wide berth," end quote. Well, whether or not Mike Chauncey ever knew of Smiley's advice, he almost immediately moved to Central City, Nebraska to go to work for Hord on the feeding station. And in 1906, he actually became a partner with Hord in several of the enterprises, and I believe he's buried in Central City. The years from 1900 until T.B. Hord's death in 1910 saw his enterprises grow dramatically via the creation of multiple companies, including the Hord and Black Cattle Company near Thedford, the Valley Stockyards Company near Valley, the T.B. Hord Grain Company with some 50 elevators along Nebraska and Iowa railroad lines, the T.B. Hord Alfalfa Meal Company, and the Lakeside Ranch Company, among others. In 1905, he was an investor in and became president of the Citizens National Bank of Cheyenne. In 1908, Hord suffered what is presumed to have been a stroke, from which he never fully recovered. When he died the day before Christmas in 1910 at the age of 60, Hord's estate exceeded $1.2 million. His son Heber and his grandson Thomas Barge Hord continued to manage various Hord businesses until the last was liquidated in the 1970s. Although the details of Thomas Hord's personal business endeavors and investments are not nearly as well documented as are the affairs of the Lance Creek Cattle Company, it seems clear that his willingness to take risks, his practical experience in raising and feeding cattle, his personal connections to livestock industry leaders of his era, and financial support from his extended family helped him ride out the travails that doomed the Lance Creek Cattle Company. Although the Hord name is little known today, barely a century ago, Thomas Benton Hord was readily recognized for his prominent role in the formative years of the Great Plains livestock industry, his perseverance during its rise, its fall, and reinvention, and his emergence as one of Nebraska's most successful entrepreneurs. Thank you very much. Before I take questions, I want to reiterate the Cowboy Exhibit, part of which is out here on the first floor. The main part is up on the third floor. If you haven't seen the exhibit yet, you only have till, I think, August 3rd. Unlike what was printed when we first produced these flyers, the original intention was going to be to keep the exhibit open till next January. But unfortunately, because, or I guess however you want to look at it, because we got the money to renovate the museum, we've had to accelerate that. So the museum being closed early in, September, I think, they're going to start taking the exhibit down on August 4th. So if you haven't seen it, you're already in the building. You can go take a look today or come back sometime before August 3rd, or if you don't, it'll be gone. With that, I'd be glad to take any questions that you might have about Thomas B. Hord, and I'll see if I can answer them.
How far east of Central City was that feedlot?
The question was, how far east of Central City was the feedlot? Well, the original main part of the feeding operation, I think, was about 3 miles east of town, somewhere in that. It was not very far east of town. Then as time went on, they, of course, expanded other feeding facilities. I think they had feed yards at Clark's, they had feed yards at Chapman, and of course, as the slide showed, they had some up by Neely and different places. So it became a really big, sprawled out operation. But the first major feeding operation was just a couple of miles or so east of Central City.
Well, it actually started the town of Hordville.
Well, there is a town, yes, and it's named after Hord. What I'm not sure of, and I didn't have time to dig out, the question was about, or the comment was about the town of Hordville. as I understand it, that town was originally named Starks or something like that. So I don't know if it was named Hordville in Hord's lifetime or if it was kind of named that after he died as to recognize him. But indeed, there is a town named for him. That's in Hamilton County, though, isn't it? Just across the river from. Yeah. Yes.
I'm trying to recall the establishment of large packing houses, I think probably in Omaha, and I think it was kind of antedating 1900. So I'm just kind of curious, how are they moving all this cattle from these places here in central Nebraska to the packing houses? Were they moving by train, or were they cowboys moving them in by herding them in, or what?
The question was relating to the big packing plants, some of which were in Omaha. There were, of course, many in Chicago and other places. How are they moving the cattle from these big feedlots to the packing plants? And I think undoubtedly they were using rail transportation because, as I pointed out in the talk a little earlier, shortly after the company, the Lance Creek Cattle Company, established their feeding operation in Central City, they actually gave a little chunk of land to the UP to put a sidetrack and loading pens, so they could easily load their cattle right on the train. And so they would have shipped them on the hoof to the slaughterhouses by rail. By this time, there were still cowboys working, but they were out on the open ranges doing the roundups and stuff. By this time, the day of the big trail drives from Texas was pretty much over.
And feedlots hadn't come into existence at that point, had they?
Well, this would be kind of the beginning, as far as I know, of the company's feedlots, and other cattlemen started feeding cattle at Central City in the 1884-85 period. So I can't say for sure whether there were other feedlots of any extent, but this would be kind of the genesis, I think, of this big fattening kind of thing where they brought the cattle down from the range and fed them on grain. Somebody that might know more about the feeding industry could answer that, perhaps. Gary.
Where did they get the hogs for their feeding operation?
The question was, where did they get the hogs for the feeding operation? I can't say for sure, but my guess is since Nebraska was raising tons of hogs in those days, they probably got them more locally. They probably bought feeder pigs here in Nebraska and just fattened them up there. They weren't raising them in Wyoming, as far as I know. Yes.
In the Texas Trail Drive days, they drove cattle into Iowa to feedlots.
Well,
And they said they had to teach them to eat corn. They'd never seen corn before.
I think that's probably true. Those old Longhorns probably thought they were in heaven when they got to eat some corn. Well, I appreciate your attention and hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much for coming.